Boston University is testing all of its students for COVID-19 in its very own lab. The results should take just 48 hours. NBC News correspondent Anne Thompson shows us this innovative and efficient new program.
Has really developed a very robust testing program by which we are testing members of the community for regular testing, regardless of symptoms.
These tests are very accurate. The test we're doing is a quantitative PCR reaction. This test is looking specifically for the RNA or for the genetic code of the virus in the nose of the person who's being swabbed.
So undergraduate students right now are being tested twice weekly, and graduate students are being tested once weekly, and that's our current cadence of testing.
It allows us to really sample the community in a way that gives us real-time information. So first of all, if someone is positive, we can call them and do contact tracing and get them isolated as quickly as possible. It also gives us a very fast feedback and data on how the virus may be transmitting in our community. If we start to see numbers going up quickly or going up in a way that is doubling too soon, we'll know a lot about where the virus is on campus.
We are willing and 100% willing to make that sacrifice and limit our contact. And then for the rest of the student body, we just have to hope that everybody is taking the right precautions.
Part of the importance of the regular testing, even if someone doesn't adhere to those individual safety practices and they're not keeping socially distanced, we're going to catch them on our testing.
I want to keep everybody around me safe just as I want to keep myself safe. So protecting those who have come into contact with me or other people who have tested positive and came in contact with me, I want to know that information just as much as I want to give it out to help stop the spread and just make sure everybody stays safe here.
An important piece of contact tracing is that when we notify close contacts, we don't release the name of the person they've been exposed to. Many times, some students and some individuals will have actually already reached out to their close contacts and told them proactively, but that is not something that we ever release in terms of identity unless it was a significantly extenuating circumstance and we would get the person's permission to do that.
And Anne joins me live now from BU. Anne, I am so impressed not only with that lab, but BU is a big school. How is the university able to process so many tests?
Well, they decided to do this, Allison, back in the spring when they looked at how they could bring everybody back to campus and keep people safe. And really, the only cost-effective way they saw was to do their own testing, and not just do their own testing, but to continuously test both students, graduate and undergrad, as well as the faculty and staff so they could track the spread of the disease. That lab is absolutely key. Those 8 robots and about a dozen people who work from 7 in the morning till about 10:30 at night, and they can process up to 6,000 tests a day, and they hope to get those results back in 24 hours. That kind of speed is key to containing the virus.
Wow, incredible work they're doing, long hours and thousands of tests. Really impressed, Anne. I understand that BU also has pretty strict social distancing rules. What are those regulations? What happens to a student who breaks them?
Boy, I'll tell you, the Dean of Students came out with a blistering letter today telling the students here at Boston University that, look, if you hold a party and there are more than 25 people, you are going to be suspended for the fall semester. That means you're kicked off campus, you cannot take classes remotely, and you cannot get a refund on your tuition, room, or board. They are absolutely serious about this. Why did they put out the letter? Because other schools that have opened before BU, and despite all the testing programs they have had, when college students do what college students like to do, and that's get together and they forget social distancing, they start drinking beer, the masks come off, they're socializing, all of a sudden you see outbreaks of COVID-19. And at BU, they are absolutely determined that is not going to happen here.
Yeah, and Boston University certainly not messing around. Thank you so much for showing us what they're doing there.
Take care, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.